Ahoy! Headhunter! What's up, everyone? I just had to double check that I was live, but we are live. Welcome, everyone, to the Headhunter Hideout. We have Steve O'Brien with us. He is the president of staffing at Jobcom. He's also worked for some big names like Monster and IBM, and he has a lot of experience within the recruiting field. So I'm super excited to have a pretty complex conversation here, probably half of which I'm not going to know all the ins and outs of, but just chatting with Steve before the show, and yeah, it's just fascinating what they're doing and what his team's doing. So welcome to the show, Steve. Appreciate you being here.
Hey, Joel, it's my pleasure, and I think we'll do all right. I think we'll learn some fun stuff, and at the end of the day, we'll be talking about recruiting, which is I think the best career you can talk about. So we'll have time.
I appreciate that, and it looks like we got about 6 people out there as well. So whoever you guys are, it's great to have you here with us. Feel free to comment and ask questions away, and we'll address those as much as we can. So Steve, I'd like to start off with all of my guests at just getting an idea of how you got started off in the talent acquisition, the recruitment field. And I always think it's fascinating to hear that. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about that from you and how you got started.
Yeah. Well, I got into recruiting similar to a lot of us. I got into recruiting accidentally. So I fell into it. I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy. Ever since I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. That was the intent. I was on the path. I did mock trials in high school, wanted to study philosophy to nail my LSATs, took my LSATs. And then I met a girl who was better looking than I deserved. And I abandoned all plans. Everything was jettisoned. My father was thrilled. It was the height of his pride in my decision-making ability as a young man. And she didn't want to do a long distance relationship. So I said, fine, where do you want to go? She was finishing her degree. And so I followed her now. She's my wife and the mother of my 2 children. So Dad's back on track. He's okay with the decision. But at the time he wasn't happy. And recruiting was one of those things where if you worked hard and you were decent at it, it didn't matter what your pedigree was. But what was unexpected for me as the reward, and I think for a lot of us that are in recruiting, this is a big piece of it. When you call somebody and tell them they got the job, the joy that they reflect back to you is intoxicating. The first candidate I ever placed was a guy named Sridhar. And you can imagine as like a 22-year-old kid that thinks that like, oh, I'm good at selling and I'm good at recruiting. Like all of my motive and thought process was like self-centered. And he took me out to lunch with his wife and 2 kids, and his wife told me what a difference it made for their family. And I was just crushed by the contrast right between like my selfish motives and the impact I had. And I got hooked. I was like, okay, if you can make money doing this, this is the place where I want to do that.
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm sure that was, it's always a difference. Like when you're in a room and you're hitting the phones and you're, having to make those client calls, or you're having to cold call people, and it's definitely like you're motivated by the rewards and what those bonuses are going to be, what those fees are going to be. And I think a lot of times there is just a massive disconnect at the actual impact you're making in someone's life. Like they're not sitting around going, wonder what my next job's going to be, until you call them and then you initiate something. And so, I'm sure being, early 20s and then having somebody take you out like that, I'm sure it kind of showed you a new side of things. So, so you make your first placement. I mean, did you know at that point, like once that happened, you're like, this is going to be it? Or are you still kind of borderline lawyer? Like how did that work out?
So I probably wrestled with whether or not I wanted talent acquisition to be a career for probably, I would say 18 months, something like that. Because there's a dark side in the sense, and I don't mean evil, I just mean hard. You are making 50 to 60 cold calls a day. Back in the day when I started recruiting, right? Not so much now, but you were hammering the phones. And recruiting is an emotional roller coaster. The highs are real high, but the lows are real low. And I wasn't sure that I was going to make it forever. What ended up convincing me that I wanted to do this forever is I got involved in what was sort of in the early days before we called it RPO. And that was a slightly more stable, slightly more strategic relationship with a customer. And that was it. That was the end of the debate for me. Being able to focus on optimizing and maximizing talent for a specific customer. And they knew my name and they called me back. And I wasn't just a third-party recruiter that they sort of called when they needed. That was that last click into place for me. And I said, all right, this is it. This is what I'm doing. No more dreams of going out and, becoming a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, you did that. I mean, how long were you involved in the RPO side of the business? I mean, it looks like 7-8 years?
Yeah, so I was RPO with Connexa and then through IBM after they acquired for 7 years. Before that, the company I was with, Zenith Technologies, I actually launched. This was before RPO was as clear a name for the service. I had launched project recruiting services. And so we did large recruiting projects for pharmaceutical manufacturing groups. Like, for example, Bristol-Myers Squibb up in Devon, Massachusetts, background like 2007, was commissioning a new manufacturing site. And Zenith Technologies, I won us the right to do most of the staffing for the commissioning of the new control system. And that's sort of where I got into it. And then once it was obvious RPO was a thing, I wanted to get in bed with a company that was more committed to talent and talent solutions like Connexa. So 2010, I joined with Connexa and took over what became their life sciences portfolio. Yeah, and that was a great ride. We started 2010 in life sciences. We were doing somewhere around 2,000 placements a year. When I left, in my portfolio alone, we were doing about 55,000 placements a year. It was an amazing ride. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So how big was that team then that was involved in those placements?
There's about 400 recruiters. We covered about 17 countries. 2015, we did a major engagement with the Philippines, launched an enormous center of excellence out in Manila, moved segments of the process out to Manila. And one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to not just sort of segment the process and send certain work streams to Manila. I wanted to send components of the whole process, so including recruiting. And so did a lot of work, spent a lot of time out in Manila, getting the team out there comfortable and believing that their US and European counterparts trusted them to manage the process and wanted to see them succeed so that they could grow into that position. And it worked. So we had hundreds of recruiters in Manila.
Wow. And I'm sure even, I mean, how did you kind of figure out even the cultural differences? Because I'm sure, recruiting internationally, I mean, there's so many nuances. So were you just like, okay, we need to have trained recruiters out there that understand the culture? I mean, how did you kind of learn the culture out there and kind of figure out how to manage people and train them up in the way that you do things, but then being open to that? Like, how did you spend time out there? How did you work that out?
So I spent a lot of time out there. And I think that there were some beliefs that I just got lucky that happened to be good or happened to align with getting the team to engage and to become effective. So I was reading a book by Adam Grant, who is a professor at University of Wharton. He's the youngest tenured professor at Wharton, to my knowledge. And he had just written a book called Give and Take. And Give and Take was challenging the idea that sort of nice guys finish last and mean guys get ahead. That book contained a lot of ideas about how to drive engagement, the value of reciprocity, and what establishing mutual trust can do from a performance perspective, right? So it was really just fortunate in a lot of ways that I was reading that. And so one of the first things that I did with the Manila team is we started small. So I knew that convincing and building relationships with 100 people at once wasn't going to work, right? So I needed to start with a team that I could actually invest in to create some authenticity in the relationship. So I think that there's a group of about 6 people who, by and large, I'm Facebook friends with today. If you guys watch this, hey, how are you doing? I still think you. But, there was about 6 of them. And I wanted to establish a culture where, one, they knew that I truly believed in them. And that believing them meant that I wanted to know more than just their work product. I wanted to know about their weekends, their passions, what led them into recruiting, what they're concerned about, and what they were proud of, right? And get that whole picture so that then when I set them loose on work itself, they knew I had their back, right? They weren't trying to impress me. They were trying to work with me. They were trying to live out the dream that we all shared and not the command that I gave, if that made sense. And then as soon as we had that special raw material of trust and a degree of authenticity, then I broke them up. And I said, all right, now you go do the same thing to another team. And we just sort of incrementally expanded that way, where culture and the working relationship preceded the technical competency. And I simply had the belief or the assumption that the technical competency would follow behind, because it's not brain surgery, it's work and it's detailed, but if I can get you to trust and to share a culture with me, then I can feed into that material the ability to recruit much more easily than I can get recruiting out of a group of people that just don't trust.
Yeah, that's huge. So how long was that process altogether? I mean, how long would you spend with people before you would kind of send them on their way to build their own teams?
Yeah, so there was a team for one of my life sciences clients, a company called Parexel, and we started with a team of 6, and we probably spent about 6 months with that first launch team. And what we moved over first was scheduling, right? So we moved over a simple process, and then we spent tons of time together. And I mean, so think about it this way. At the time, I probably had 300 staff, and with this group of 6 people, I would spend maybe 4 or 5 hours a week. Now, that's not a ton of hours, but as a proportion of time, that small group of people got a lot of time, right? And it took about 6 months before I was ready to launch another account. And so what I would do is I would take 3 of those people and break them off as a launch team for the next account. And then again, just try and ritualize that sort of humanizing behavior as first and foremost important for a rationally self-interested reason. I'd love to say that I'm just a virtuous guy. I don't know that I can take credit for that. It's actually just what works, right?
Yeah.
And then after every instance, it goes faster and faster because you have more raw material to work with, right? So that 6 becomes 12, becomes 24, becomes 48 very quickly.
No, that's awesome. Well, I just wanted to just to touch upon one of these questions here too. So I don't know if you could see that in the back, but Daniel here just said, I've been contacted by recruiters from LinkedIn and Indeed. All have shown heavy interest in me. Have not delivered. I'm starting to lose faith in the recruiting process. Please provide some feedback. So Daniel, I think we're gonna touch probably upon some of these things as we go into the conversation, but just wanted to make sure that you knew that we got that question. I actually wanted to go back and touch upon something that you said as kind of a passing comment, but you had mentioned about like the 50-60 cold calls and that not necessarily being as prevalent today as it maybe once was. I found with a lot of the people I've interviewed, a lot of the agency owners, that the 50-60 phone calls, it's still, alive and kicking. So I'm just curious to your take on, obviously you've spent a lot of time on the technology side of things, AI and understanding how technology can aid with the recruiting process to maybe help address some of these issues that even Daniel's talking about. But I'd love to just hear your take on kind of what you actually see, what you think as far as recruiting, like how that's kind of going away and how technology is coming in and aiding people and how it can actually help recruiters. Because I think you got a lot of insight into that. So I'd love to just go in that direction.
Yeah. So let me frame this a couple ways. And for the listeners, I promise it'll make sense in the end. So the first idea, like 50-60 cold calls versus not, you have one aspect of that difference in experience from an industry orientation. So if you're on the agency side and you've got 2-3 requisitions and you're being paid 20 to 25% of first year salary, you're probably going to lean in a highly time consuming strategy that is going to produce more results across a shorter period of time. What I was thinking of when I said not as much is I was actually referencing back to some of the corporate and RPO experience, where if you have 40 requisitions, the joke that I always tell is if you got 40 requisitions and 40 hours in a week, how many hours per rec do you have? You've got 1, right? If you work on every rec every other week, you've got 2. How many cold calls can you make per rec in 2 hours? It's not 50 or 60, right? And so like on one hand, you've got this division in your orientation towards the industry that changes your work style. The second thing that I've seen happen that I don't know is necessarily great, but it seems to be a phenomenon, at least on the corporate recruiting side. LinkedIn has a way of dulling your creativity and allowing you to, without knowing you're not doing a great thing, supplant good market engagement with in-mails and spam, right? Because it gives you the illusion of productivity and you blame the market or some other factor for the lack of results, as opposed to realizing that relying on one tool and one strategy, which is shooting out emails, is probably not great. Now, to where can technology help? We're going to talk about this probably a little bit more in some detail. But technology and AI in particular is doing a better job at uncoding or cracking the language game to make search results more accurate. So if you go back to like 2005, 2006, I think 2006-ish is when Monster launched its smart search, or I think that's what they called it. And what it would do is try and take plain text and create a Boolean string out of it. That was just keyword matching. And that's not terrible, but it also doesn't deal with many of the edge cases. So that's frustrating. And what AI is trying to do now, in particular, if I was to sum it up, it's trying to deal with the edge cases more effectively. And the way that you do that is by cracking the language game. What happens when you crack the language game is you improve the accuracy of search results so that you have less engagement, like this individual that asked the comment, that isn't aligned with their background. Right, you do a better job of matching recruiters with jobs that match candidates and candidates with skills that match the jobs, so that those communications are more efficient because they're better matched, but they're still human. Right, it feels inhuman when you get sent, like if I get sent a job, and not that there's anything wrong with somebody thinking that I want to be a recruiter, but I'm probably not an entry-level recruiter currently. There's nothing wrong with that. Probably not the right job for me. I get those jobs all the time, right?
Yeah.
And instead of sort of feeling like, oh, that the recruiter's an idiot, it just feels inhuman, right? It feels like you've not paid attention to me and that kind of thing. And so where technology, if it works, and we've got a lot of technical problems to solve still in the industry, but if it works, it's going to help bring humanity back to some of the scale-oriented work, like emailing and searching and that kind of stuff, hopefully so that you don't have to do 50 to 60 phone calls if you're an agency recruiter. But right now, that's how it works.
Yeah, and I think, you know, from my experience, obviously in that agency world, it's to your point, the quickest way to get results is to, you know, target 50 to 60 people that look like they're an 80% match, maybe even less in some cases. And, you know, you just, obviously if you cold call people, it's a numbers game. You control a numbers game. And I think, but to your point, I think it's having all of those tools in the tool belt and understanding that you can, you know, like for example, with LinkedIn, I think LinkedIn has become, you know, it's just an easy way to fire out 300 emails. Email is the same thing. But that activity within itself, it creates all of these issues that people are talking about. So you will have recruiters that will blast out 300 emails, and maybe Daniel, who is a person that made that comment, gets one of these emails, but they never really, they weren't really doing it because Daniel is even a good fit. It's just an easy way to get some results, which is you know, pretty terrible when you think about it. What about like on the other side with like the easy apply button, for example? Like that's obviously makes that was, I'm sure, envisioned to make the candidate experience great. Like, hey, you don't have to fill out an application. You don't have to go through all this. You can just press easy apply. But if you got 50,000 people pressing that easy apply, it's so overwhelming for an internal recruiter. So what are your thoughts on like how we could do better with that part of the process and like making it still accessible, but not too accessible?
Yep. So I've been married for 14 years, so I'm not telling this story from personal experience. But for anybody on the call that has used Tinder, Tinder is the ultimate easy apply, right? And what happens is women become more selective and men don't get as many responses, right? Or you have a real like bifurcation of the user experience. If you don't solve the core problem of match and you simply decrease the friction in asking for a match, you don't really solve the problem. So I'm not going to throw stones at easy apply. I think it's better that it's easy to apply in the sense that user experience that used to exist was terrible. But the unintended consequence of easy apply is corporate recruiters get flooded with easy applies. And so they downgrade their selectivity and engagement with the applicant base, and you have more people that applied to a job that never hear back, right? So you still have this friction in the relationship between the recruiter and the candidate. It's just that you've moved that friction from, instead of it being about the apply experience, now it's about the actual communication, right? The recruiter's less likely to engage with the resume because they've got 60, and the candidate's less likely to hear back because the recruiter's not engaging with the resume. So again, this is why I love what Job.com is doing. And I've been working in this particular area of AI for HR for even back when I was at IBM, is you have to do a better job of aligning interest and ability across the recruiter and the candidate spectrum, and then add efficiency and simplicity of communication. If you don't have that, and ultimately you're just flooding one party or another with work or friction, you've still got a broken process.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this a little bit because I think obviously you spent some time at Monster, so I'd love to hear a little bit. What exactly were you doing at Monster? Why don't we talk about that a little bit just before what was your role there?
exclusively secret projects. It's all confidential. No, I joined Monster back in 2017. So Monster, so Monster is a brand that a lot of us have a lot of affection for. I have said many times, I proposed to my wife on the back of dollars that I made using Monster. And that's not make believe. I had a Monster license, and that's what I made placements through. So I love Monster. But Monster is also one of the first movers in the online recruiting space. And like anybody, innovation and changing commercial model eventually makes it hard for you to exist. And that's happened to Monster. And so they've been going through a period of transformation. And in 2017, when I joined, it was just after the acquisition by Randstad. And so Monster wanted to run a bunch of controlled pilots to see in what areas of the talent market could they carve out a position commercially. And then of those areas, which ones made sense for the brand long term. So I launched a human capital solutions business that leveraged some third-party technology and some Monster technology to bring down the cost of agency recruitment. And so we had it was about a 10% first year salary cost per hire model. And then we would do some recruiting projects as well. And it was a lot of fun. We went from basically zero performance-based revenue to about 15 million in performance-based revenue across that 3 years. But it turned out that the human capital services business wasn't strategically aligned with where Monster wanted to go long-term. So that business was very logically moved over to Randstad SourceRight, their parent company, and installed into their RPO business. But it was an experiment. And while we were running that experiment, when it came to understanding the way that we were going to pull together technology and human capital, we did partner with several companies that are in the Randstad Innovation Fund, like Wade and Wendy, and Randstad, with the incredible amount of candidate data that they have to create some automated recruiting processes that we would be able to plug into the MSP market, right? So on contract labor, for those that buy contract labor through VMS systems or through MSP services, we would create a tier 0 product that was less expensive because it was automated. That project, I don't think that we need to pretend we don't know the name now. At the time, it was called Project Rogue because it was a secret, but it worked and it was a lot of fun. And it was just one of the things that we got off the ground while I was at Monster. So
then, from Monster, then that's when you transitioned into Job.com. Mm-hmm. So again, we talked a little bit about this before we hopped on the live, but obviously things have changed a little bit with COVID. And I know you've been sharing, but what's like the mission and what are you guys trying to accomplish with Job.com, compared to some of the other websites that are encouraging people to submit their data?
So there's 3 things that we look at Job.com that maybe sort of like shape the boundaries of what we're doing. One, and this is not a novel perspective, but it is certainly ours, is that the talent market is a highly imperfect market. It doesn't seem to produce fair competition. It doesn't seem to produce all sorts of things that you would anticipate in a market that isn't highly imperfect. And part of the reason that it's highly imperfect is it's so fractured and you have so many different ways to consume and interact with the market. So one thing that we want to do is we want to bring the various ways to interact with the market into one organization and onto one technology platform. So like I was telling you before, when we look at the imperfect market, we think of it in 3 chunks. On one end, you've got the segment of the market where job posting works, right? And we all know that segment of the market, especially if you're a corporate recruiter, you have a job and you know that you get the right applicants. The market's okay there. And then on the other end, you have a different chunk where you need to use an agency for various different reasons. And in the middle, you have the question of optimization and corporate recruiter time, right? So these are the recs that if you don't work them, they probably won't be filled. They're not so hard and time consuming that you want to send them to an agency, but the job posting is just not going to work. We bring those 3 types of markets into the Job.com platform. One, so that we can then start running all of our data through a single platform to begin predicting what kind of job are we looking at so that we can make recommendations about product and cost that's appropriate for the skill set. And then the third thing that we're working on is if you're in a big data business like Job.com, we're not Google, of course, but I'm going to make an analogy to Google's business. You're in a business that's using surveillance data, right? You are trading with the user in exchange for their data some kind of value. And there's a real question, is the value exchange between Google and a user fair? I'm not saying it's not, but it's a good question. You get a free email client, they get all your data. Is that a good balance? For us, we're not sure. And so what we want to do is we want to make the user a shareholder in the value of the data and also a determinant on whether or not their data is allowed to be used. And so we're trying to approach a surveillance business with an ethical point of view that is at least unique, right? And so those are sort of the three things that Job.com is working on right now.
So are you approaching then to like the passive candidate market, so the people who aren't necessarily looking for a job? Like how do you approach them? Because I think obviously when I think of a job board, usually it's just super targeted at people who are either looking for a job, they're active. I guess there is obviously I get a ton of emails from Indeed and Monster and everywhere where my resume is. I'll get these emails, but how do you? I think of that middle portion that, you can't just have these certain jobs where a job posting won't work and you kind of need that agency. Like, how do you make that perfect marriage between those two? And is that where AI comes in? Like, how do you work that process?
Yeah. So there's two areas where we have products that are in design currently that are going to help crack into that middle. One product is the unified career profile. So if you ask yourself, when does job search start? It wouldn't be uncommon to say when I go to Indeed, right? But the truth is probably the job search starts when you're not sure you're at the right place.
Yeah.
And not knowing that you're at the right place doesn't always result in job search, but that's when the opportunity begins to emerge. And so we're beginning to recruit users through functionality and features on the platform that help you start exploring the question, am I at the right place? The way that it happens now is you're not sure that you're in the right place, and you talk to your buddy Mark at the bar, and you talk to your wife, right? And your wife says, honey, you deserve more. And your buddy Mark says, I don't know, maybe it's not so bad, right? But you get these various inputs into your life. Job.com wants to give you a digital place where you can explore the idea, what are people like me making? What are other career experiences? And what are some of the things I should consider about whether or not this is still a good fit between me and my employer? And by offering value to that conversation before the job search decision has been made, we have the ability to start recruiting and engaging users in advance. That pulls us deeper into the passive market, as we sort of generically referred to it, by understanding better what it's like to be passive.
Man, which is super smart. And that's obviously, I think about that a lot, where, I mean, that's the big struggle with an Indeed, is if you have your job posted on there, automatically, if someone is replying to it, they're replying to 5 other jobs. So it's trying to catch people with the right position for them before they're fully active. But then even within that, once somebody's in that active place, they're more than likely going to do what's best for them and kind of be looking around all over the place. I'm also curious too. I know we talked about this before backstage. So you're also acquiring staffing firms, recruitment agencies, and creating almost like that ultra network of specialized, recruitment agencies, and really being able to, I think with that approach, you're then really, really tackling every possible area that a client could find use for, and it helps the candidates as well. So how like that to me seems like a pretty new idea. Is that a new idea, or how did you guys kind of come up with that, or what's the strategy behind that?
So I think I think our point of view on why to do it is probably unique. We have 2 reasons that we're working on it. And before I say those reasons, I will reiterate, Job.com's goal is to unify the marketplace. And the reason we want to do that is it's highly imperfect. The market includes agencies. We're not looking to exclude agencies. We're also a tech company that doesn't see a future where the market is improved by removing humans. Humans are not the problem with the recruiting market. Data, blind data, and misaligned incentives are what we want to solve. And so when we look at acquiring agencies, we're not trying to fix anything. We're trying to make rational business decisions to bring a company in where we can add value to them, and the data that they produce adds value to our models, right? So that's the very simple way is, look, there's all these mid-market agencies out there. And if you're a mid-market agency and you're listening, or you know somebody, tell them to call me. We are heavily recruiting for good acquisitions. We want to buy mid-market agencies that are strong, that have brand identity, that know who they are, that want to keep doing what they're good at. Because we want you, after the acquisition, to keep doing what you're good at. But what we want to add to you is we want to add some digital customer acquisition strategies that are a business process. We don't want to change your brand or your aesthetic, but we want to change some business processes so that we can add wind to your sales there. And then the second thing that we want to do is we want to give you the ability to sell the capabilities of other agencies in the company to the customers that you already have. So a good example is we recently bought a cybersecurity business, and we're about to close on a healthcare business, staffing companies. All right, so the cybersecurity company we'll be able to sell cybersecurity talent to the hospitals that the healthcare business already has as their customers. And some of the cybersecurity customers are going to consume healthcare talent that are the cybersecurity customer base already. So you add a network effect and some power driving down the cost of customer acquisition without needing to say, we're going to change your brand, we want to change you. I don't want to do any of that. I want to add to you the network effect of strong agency relationships.
Is this purely on the staffing side then, or is this also for permanent placement?
So the staffing companies that we'll look at have perm and contract revenue. And we aren't necessarily looking at one versus the other. What we have seen is that if you're a perm only business right now, you might be having a lot of problems. Maybe you're not. And if you're not, God bless you. But the perm market has faced extraordinary pressure during COVID. The contract market has done fairly well. So the companies that end up doing well through our due diligence and being a good match with Job.com quite frequently have a blend of revenue of contract and direct placement.
Okay, so if there's someone listening out there, I mean, how would you describe like the perfect company that you would look and say, hey, this is who we're going to be able to bring the most value to, and this is who's going to get the most value out of this deal? I mean, what does that look like for you?
So specialty firms tend to outperform in a network strategy. Right. So if you're a generalist and you're already a generalist, I don't add as much to you as if you're a specialty firm. Right. Because if I can add other skill sets and characteristics to your recruiting capabilities, then I'm adding something. But if you already are a generalist and just have deep saturation in a small set of customers, it's a legitimate question. How much am I going to add to you? So the proposals and the conversations that have been most progressive have been the ones that have a specialization and then the ability to visualize the network effect working. The second thing is an organization that is probably somewhere in the $10 to $40 million in annual revenue space that have the ability to understand how some standardized business processes and a few platform technologies would help, but have just not gotten to the point where that investment made sense or was an investment that they were ready to make, right? Because we are ready to make that, and that's part of what we want to bring to an acquisition. Those just make good matches.
Yeah. Well, I think that it gives you that ability then to be able to, number one, not lose business to the like the monster companies, or I shouldn't have said monster company, but the really the big names in the industry that you're competing against already. That's obviously going to give you that edge, and you can refer people. You're going to get business referred into you, and it really helps you become. I would at least think that one stop where you're able to say, hey, don't go to these other places. Like we have a network that we're a part of. And you also get to keep your branding as well, which it's really smart. I always think that, in any kind of acquisition, the branding is hard to make up. And then you also keep your employees as well. So that's obviously, huge as well. So, I think that's a pretty amazing deal, honestly. I mean, I can't really see too many downsides with it.
I thought long and hard about the brand question and the integration strategy for the companies. And one of the things that I think is really important to dwell on as you're looking at the acquisition strategy for a staffing firm is what creates value. I don't know that I'm right, but I do know what I believe. What I believe is that the value is emergent from consensus amongst a bunch of people that agree to adhere to a brand, to set up brand practices, and like a founder, trust a founder, right? And so if you have a business where a lot of the value is on the back of something ineffable in a sense or intangible like that, you need to have an integration and acquisition strategy that doesn't cannibalize that, right? So if I come in and say that like, oh, we just bought you and we're changing your brand and your leaders are going and we're going to muck around with all your operational practices, you're going to crush the value, let alone crushing the people. You're just going to crush the value. And so we needed to have a plan that preserved the value, because we're not just an acquisition business. We're not just acquiring staffing firms to go off and sell it to the public markets or something like that. We are also doing technology, and we're also doing cost per click, right, as a product offering. And so we needed a stable and non-destructive acquisition strategy that added something to the companies that we bought.
Yeah, no, I love it. And especially the part about crushing the people, because I mean, anytime you come in and you're like, hey, we're going to do things completely differently, I mean, you're bound to lose 80% of the people. And then that creates a problem within itself, because, people don't want to change. And not to say that people shouldn't change, but it could create a really big challenge, for people to stay in there. What are your thoughts with like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I recently had a conversation with a third-party software that was selling to me the value of the reporting suite, and it was valuable and it was sweet, right? However, the challenge is that if my first move when I had a company I was integrating was, hey, guess what? Good news. I'm changing your reporting and operating procedures and technology. And they said, well, why are you doing that? And my answer was, so that my job is easier. They'd be like, like, what the heck? And so, you know, those are sort of non-intuitive things that you gotta chew through, right? To make sure that you're putting first and foremost the source of value, which is the people and their rhythm and their consensus.
And obviously, I mean, even on the prem side of the business, it's all, you know, no one, it's all to do with the individual recruiters, and it's all to do with the quality of recruiting, which is why you can become a great agency recruiter. And, you know, obviously the thing that's usually keeping you there is the fact that there's a non-compete. I mean, if we didn't have non-competes in the business, you know, you do well, and then within 3 years, you'd be like, I'm just going to do this myself. And not to say that there's obviously a lot of value with like the support and operations and the camaraderie and the atmosphere that comes with working with an agency, which you don't get working solo. But that's the intangible value with recruiting. It's like you can't, and I like what you said, that you're a technology company that sees the human side in things, and the human side isn't going to go away, because that is the intangible of recruiting. It's always the recruiter as a human themselves. And it's not even necessarily their technical skills. A lot of times it's how much they actually care compared to the reward. So if the reward means everything to them, then, you know, it's going to be hard. You're going to be hard pressed to find recruiters to actually get back to people. But it's a really hard balance. And I think all of the best recruiters that I've ever talked to, they are incredibly successful, but they also really care about people. And you know, it's so I think it's really cool that's how you see it. I'm curious to hear, like, what do you think, like, obviously coming into this more, you know, COVID-19, new normal, digital seems to be growing and expanding. Everybody's looking at their digital strategies as far as marketing and connecting with people and automation and all of these things. What are some big mistakes that you think people are either kind of making unwittingly with technology, or just like what are the big mistakes that you're seeing people make from like an old school perspective into this kind of newer time in recruiting?
I think there's two. And if you're not making this mistake, pat yourself on the back and share it with a friend. And if you see somebody, feel courageous to challenge the assumption. So pre-COVID, to some degree, more sort of like 2010, but like definitely pre-COVID, there was more of a professional persona and a private persona, and the professional persona was a bit more synthetic and refined, and private was mushy and approachable. If you're trying to maintain that distinction, you're probably going to suffer fatigue, right? It's not survivable, in my experience or my observations, to keep a strong delineation between the image I have on Zoom and the control I have over my office when my kids bang in the door and act offended. I'm not offended. They're here. Leland's 5, Grace is 2. If they show up, it's not a hostile takeover, right?
I would love that. So
yeah, right. So you've got to allow a bit of dilution of both parts, right? Professional becomes a little bit more personal, and personal probably becomes a little bit more professional. That's by design. But the second thing I think is more interesting, and probably not quite as intuitive. There's something that we used to value, that we still do value, but don't have as much of, and that's sort of water cooler talk, right? It's a cliche. It's bonding. It's the grease for the skids for a tough conversation. It's an informal way to get work done. The question is, what was water cooler talk primarily about? Was it primarily about relationship building, or was it primarily about informal professional exchange? I think it was primarily about relationship building. I know that I had lots of professional conversation, but that's because they didn't have something else in common with the person to build that relationship. What I was doing at the coffee pot, the water cooler, the lunch table, was building the relationships that make a business cohere and cooperate. So now we're in a digital space, right? I might not be able to create water cooler moments, but I can find ways that are primarily relationship focused that facilitate cooperation and relationship building. And that is games. It may not seem professional. It may not seem intuitive. right? But games are a place where you have an easy and low friction way to interact, to share something, to build memories together, and to build relationships. Even though it's not professional, it doesn't matter if water cooler talk wasn't primarily about the work. If it was primarily about the relationship, find new ways in a digital space like games to build relationships and common memories, so that when you do have the tough conversations and you need to cooperate, you have that shared experience to rely on to make cooperation easier.
What about someone brought this up last week? They were just saying, particularly in recruiting, like so much of the learning is done through observation and being like close. So, let's say you're a mid-sized firm and you've got your kind of flagship 10 people, or 50% of the people like flagship, like they've been there for 10, 15 years, maybe more, probably more. And they've got like this, they've got the experience, they've got the counter offer down, or where they just know the script and they know how they're just like well-oiled machines. They know how to build relationships. They know how to have small talk. They know how to handle all these different situations. And then you've got like the kind of like the rookies who are 6 months in, that everything's brand new for them.
Yep.
How do you like, because I think so much of the environment is like you just learn from osmosis and hearing and just being around those conversations. How do you get around that? I mean, how do you bring people, especially in recruiting, where it's just not complicated, but it is complicated, and it's the EQ and that everything just combined. So how do you see as like being able to bring people into the industry in that type of way?
Yeah, there's a lot of artistry in recruiting. That's for sure. And one of the things that you have when you're around each other is a way to capture teachable moments without being abrupt, right? And so you've got chit chat emerging immediately after a phone call. You've got eyes, right? Like support or pivot type of communication that just helps you navigate a call, especially as you're learning recruiting. So we have had COVID affect our entry-level hiring. That's the truth, right? And it has been harder for us to figure out how to fully feed and develop an entry-level recruiter when we can't create sort of bullpen style teachable moment opportunities. One of the things that we have started doing, though, that has helped is storytelling on purpose, right? And so just storytelling and reflecting out loud about our experiences and doing, we would do this again. We would change that next time type of reactions to the stories to help people to replay, even though the moment is gone, in a non-conflict oriented way, points of view about the situation. So storytelling is not a perfect replacement for teachable moments, but it's similar and it helps.
So is that like within like meetings then, or within like a webinar type thing, or how? Yeah.
Morning and PM huddles. Yeah.
Got it.
A situation that I came across that I didn't know how to navigate. The point is not to criticize the person, and you got to set the rules, right? We're not trying to make somebody perfect. We're not trying to train them, right, in the sense of teach them to do right what they did wrong. We're reflecting on situations and looking at things that we would do again that way, or things that we might do differently. The gentleness is important because the gentleness is present in the teachable moment in the bullpen, right? You're not slamming people that sit next to you at the desk. You're just chit-chatting about the situation. And so making sure that the team knows when you get together for your PM huddles or your AM huddles and your storytelling, we're not training and we're not correcting. We're reflecting on the situation together to give raw material to think through, so that next time you've got a broader experience base to inform how you handle the candidate or how you handle the negotiation with the hiring manager.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. Because I think so many times, like when we do open up about those experiences, like the first thing that happens is somebody tells you like kind of where you went wrong and like what you should do, as opposed to kind of letting the story play out and almost collaboratively discuss like how to do things. Yeah, that's huge.
The leadership team does have to play a firm role in creating sort of the boundaries of the conversation and make sure that people understand we are not training and we are not correcting. If you want to correct, that's a different conversation. And there's a verbal tactic that helps. I don't think it's not a 10 commandment type item, but it helps get you in the right frame of mind when your response to the person that's telling the story is yes and. Right? So yes, and, or you're trying to add to the idea as opposed to edit down the idea. The idea of expansion is helpful. The idea of concision or getting down to something condensed or derivative is not helpful. Right? So yes, and is a useful verbal tactic to help set the tone of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I love that. And so, okay, so we touched upon like the to lead the team digitally. I'm curious too, like what are some of the big mistakes that you see, like just recruiters doing in general, like with technology? Like obviously technology makes it easy to do a quick keyword search, get 1,000 candidates, and bomb them with an email, for example. Like what are ways that you're seeing like people just misusing, and like how could they get more effective like today? Like how, if somebody's out there and they have a really large database, or they've obviously got LinkedIn, like how do you recommend that people use these tools to make them more efficient? And what are some of the big kind of things that you see that people are just dropping a ball on?
Yeah. So when you're distanced from somebody through a technology, it's easy to stop thinking of them as people. When you're on the phone, it's harder to not think of them as a person. And so I see a lot of recruiters. So for example, LinkedIn Recruiter. And my point is not to criticize LinkedIn Recruiter, say to never use it. But when you send an in-mail through LinkedIn Recruiter, it shows up as an in-mail, right? As soon as you send an in-mail, or if you're a user and you click on that, you immediately go into buy, don't buy mode. You're not connecting with somebody. You're not talking to somebody. You know they're selling to you. And that's a different frame of mind than if you just had a connection request or a dialogue, right? And so consider if you're working through a passive market and you're just spamming everybody with in-mails and they're showing up labeled in-mail, if I don't view myself...
And they stay on there, they say, yeah, interested or not. So they lead you into even thinking that right from the get-go.
100%, right? And so think about the tool and think about the tool's effect on the user. And if you're trying to recruit non-active talent, understand that LinkedIn Recruiter might not be your best technique. So I was working with a recruiter on a project in Chicago. We were looking for a design specialist for interior design, for workplace design at a mid-sized design firm in Chicago. There's a lot of designs in one sentence. And we were using LinkedIn Recruiter, and we were getting absolutely no results. And the recruiter at the time had been seduced in a way that a lot of recruiters are to think like, if I can't find it on LinkedIn, they don't exist, right? That's sort of the end of the thought process. And that's not everybody. And if that's not you, awesome. But for some, that is a struggle. And I said, look, let's just think for a second that maybe the person that we're recruiting doesn't immediately think of themselves as a candidate, just maybe. And so let's go through and let's make connection requests with all these people. And instead of asking for, and this is all recruiting trick stuff, right? You guys may already do this, but instead of asking them if they're interested in the job, ask them if they can give you some advice on how to run the search in Chicago, right? Get conversations started. So the way that search ended up playing out is we did make the placement. We did make the placement by starting a conversation with somebody that was making a recommendation on how to navigate the talent market for design in Chicago, and eventually realized that now might be a time that she'd be open to considering a new role. And then we started recruiting her. But we would have never had that conversation if the barrier to the conversation was you have to see yourself as a candidate, right? So, you know, what's the principle? The principle is always be human on purpose, and don't let the technology dehumanize in a way that you're not familiar with or aware of, because it's going to affect your search results.
So, okay, so with something like bulk email, because I think bulk email is the great example. And I'm personally like really against automation. That's just my whole kind of thing, and I talk about it all the time, and that's just my being a rebel, I guess. But I've seen things out there like, you know, ways to personalize like bulk email, for example, and like people are smart. Like you can say, you know, you can put like a quick hack to show that, hey, I'm interested in you because of your experience with this company, and then it seems personalized. So there's these messages that come through that seem personalized, but they're still pretty easy to see through. So what's your take on that? Like, you know, and this is from like probably an agency kind of corporate recruiter take, obviously, but like what are your thoughts with that type of technology and how it's impacted the industry as a whole?
So people are pattern recognition machines. We just are. And as soon as somebody thinks they found a new pattern that isn't, you know, bulk email indicative, then the market realizes very quickly that that's the new pattern, right? We have a similar problem in AI. It's an idea called concept drift and data drift. So for example, if you tried to write an AI program that caught spammers, and you define spammers as individuals that send more than 10 emails within a minute, if you had the natural user base start exhibiting that behavior, you're going to falsely classify the regular user as a spammer, right? And so because you have a static definition, you're not going to realize it. But very quickly, if a human looked at that, they said, oh, here's what's happening. When LinkedIn users interact with that, you may have a definition of spam or a definition of personalization, but as soon as the user base recognizes the pattern, it's not going to exhibit what you're hoping that it exhibits. Now, that may not matter, right? And so it's not obvious that just because the user is going to recognize that it's spam, that it matters. So there are some markets where you're recruiting routine skill sets where supply is not a problem and efficiency of outreach is sufficiently valuable, right? And so if I was, leading a corporate recruiting team and we had a skill set where we don't have fundamentally an imbalance in supply and demand, then we're going to do routine outreach. And I would love to be able to do personalized work. But at the end of the day, it works well enough to do both emails, right? The truth is, I'm probably going to make that decision because it works. But if I have an area where supply and demand are imbalanced and I can't afford to miss any of the shots on goal that I have available to me, I'm not going to spam them. And I'm not going to spam them or bulk email them thinking that I'm tricking the user, because we're pattern recognition machines. Unless you're the first one to conceive of a new way to avoid appearing synthetic, you're probably going to appear synthetic, right? So put the time into actually making the outreach personal in some unique way or informal in some unique way, because your results are going to improve.
I mean, we're seeing that a lot too, by the way, on LinkedIn. Like I'm seeing it from a lot of industries, and it's not just recruiting. It's I'm seeing a lot of financial advisors, for example, reach out, or there's just there's a lot of people right now kind of reaching out with like the connection request, and then you get spammed, and it's clearly automation, and even the timing of it. And then I've even seen people go, okay, well, they know it's automated if the message comes out a minute later, so we'll delay it 12 hours to make it seem like we're a real person. And it's just,
it doesn't work.
It works maybe like the first time, but then when you're like, wow, it clocked exactly 24 hours since I connected with the person, and now they're sending me a message, gives it away right away.
You down regulate how seriously you take the communication source, right? Like if your inbox is generally filled with garbage, you down regulate what you view in your inbox, whether you want to do it or not. Recruiters do this with applicants, and so here's a funny thing that our industry sort of ping ponged around on. So they say that passive talent is better than active talent, right? Whether you adhere to that or not, it's certainly a cliche that we say, right? Here's the thing that's a little weird about that, is knowing that now's the right time for a career change and that you're the company I want to join make me less talented. How on earth am I less talented by knowing that now's the right time and you're the right place? Of course it doesn't make me less talented, right? Totally. And how is being sort of lost adrift at sea, just working away at the company I've been at for 10 years and, sort of unaware that life is happening outside that I could be attracted to, make me more talented, right? Yeah. Like the passive and active component has very little as a explanation for why we see talent that way. But here's a better explanation. Passive talent, I'm hand selecting according to people that meet the criteria that I'm looking to talk to. Applicants are candidate selected. And so when I go through an applicant base, I might find 10 candidates in there that are really interesting, but I'm also going to find 40 that are a mismatch. I can't tell that subconsciously what's happening is I'm down regulating the quality of the applicant. Over time, I just start to think, applicants are a mixed bag of riffraff. That doesn't mean active candidates are less talented, right? And that 10 that were talented are just as talented, and the passive talent aren't more talented just because you're up selecting to only those that you want to talk to. We do the same thing with our inbox.
It's man, that's such a great point. And it also gets compounded then too, when obviously if you're in a sales meeting, and I mean, it's just been done so many times. People can't possibly believe it, but it is that whole, like the hidden, there's like some kind of like magic hidden place that, you're going to be able to access people that are unaccessible. And it's like nowadays with the amount of data that we have anyway, and the amount of information that's out there. I mean, there's a super small percentage of people that are maybe out there, but yeah, it's so true, man. And I love the way you just put that. Like it's almost something subconscious.
It's mostly nonsense. It's mostly the way that we think, and that's innocent enough. I had a conversation with a friend at Monster, another vice president in the organization, and it was a very sincere comment. It was a person that's been in the industry a long time, and they were talking about why we needed to get into passive talent. Now, this is not a place for conversations about prejudices or sort of shiny slogans that we sell to customers. This is about essential correlation between sellable product and tools that produce sellable product. Like, I don't care about slogans or beliefs here. I want data and results. So the person had challenged me. They said, well, we need to make sure that we have a passive candidate strategy because that's where the best talent is. And I remember just sort of pausing the conversations and like, can't you and I, Do you not understand that that's nonsense that we use as a sales position and not actually an attribute of the data, right? The only thing that we can attribute, in my humble opinion, to the passive talent is its ability to expand the data set, right? And there may be attributes of that data set that are not present in the active talent base, but quality is not a dominant differentiator between the two data sets. There's lots that we find when we run machine learning algorithms on the two data sets, but talent is not one of the dividing factors.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, the more accessible everyone is to the same information, the more the passive versus active kind of selling point favors the person who's selling it, because it's like now, you know, back in the day, it was like selling on a database. Like I would be, I mean, I don't know if I've heard too many people selling on databases recently and say, hey, we've got a big database, because it's like, okay, you can make your own database in 20 minutes. LinkedIn, you want to get a little bit more creative, maybe Zoom Info is another one. I mean, you can make a database pretty quickly. And I think that passive active is the same, but it doesn't do any, I think that doesn't help the situation now. And, you know, particularly with COVID, where there's a lot of active people, there's plenty of great people out there. There's plenty of great people that have been furloughed. So how's your business strategy with what you're doing with Job.com? How have you guys had to switch things with the amount of active candidates that you have out there, and kind of have you had to do anything different, obviously with COVID, as far as the business model goes?
So we've changed our business model a little bit. And if you've gone on the site maybe 6 months ago, this will be familiar. If not, it won't be as much. But we used to position our product commercially to corporations as a 7% placement fee, where the candidate gets 5%. And there's a lot of reasons why we did that. One of the reasons is, like I had said at the start, we're looking to find interesting ways to be an ethical surveillance data company, right? And we think the value exchange is more than just you have access to our website. The challenge was, because of the way that we framed that product, the customer thought to themselves, oh, well, I don't want to pay the 5% to the candidate, right? They thought that was sort of optional. It wasn't optional. But because that led to friction in conversations with customers, we have had to reframe the way the product works, because what we do with our users to try and incentivize and reinstantiate them as shareholders is not a debate that we're going to have with our customers, right? So that's one way it's affected us. The other way it's affected us is it has helped us consume a lot more exhaust data from just general web activities. And that's helped us with our machine learning models. And it's also given us an imperative to rethink how we're trying to tackle some of the language problems that exist in AI for HR. So just briefly, AI for HR, one of the things that we have as a challenge is the magnitude of effect. This sort of technical jargon, but I think we can make it plain English. How much a specific keyword correlates with being hireable is not that significant. So the magnitude of effect of a keyword is pretty low, which means that you need a lot of instances of training data to draw the correlations. That's challenging because we actually just don't get enough data flowing through most of our systems in order to create the training set to produce the predictions, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and so
makes sense.
What we've had to do is we've had to figure out a way to allow or to inspire our users, our recruiters, to opt in freely to being a part of the semi-structured learning that happens on our AI system without having to pay them, right? So there's some AI companies, especially ones that came out about 4 years ago, that had a model to do sort of the semi-structured learning by having the staff on their payroll working behind the scenes, right? Like the ghost in the machine. The problem with that model is that you actually can't afford to pay those people, right? Like having all of that talent on your payroll eventually sort of bogs your model down. And so because we have the luxury of seeing that failed for others, we've realized, especially during COVID, as we've had to sort of do a step back and a rethink, that we need to design a user interface that allows users to create language overlays that are particular to their industry and particular to their company, that are created by them as opposed to by us, right? And then a value that's portable to the corporation, right? And so then the corporation owns that language overlay that helps their corporation navigate unstructured data like the resume more effectively through the input of their users, as opposed to through the input of people that are at the Job.com payroll level.
Got it. Well, that makes a, what about, I'm curious too, with like, because when I think about hiring now, I mean, I guess it's depends on the types of roles, like you mentioned before. Like a high volume search, obviously keywords work pretty well.
Yep.
But what about, like culture and things like that? I mean, is that something that you see being able to like address through, like this type of thing where you've got candidates who are entering their data, and then you have end users that are searching it and the clients that are searching? Like how do people kind of deal with the culture side of it? Or is that something you see that's possible or in the future?
So the short answer is yes. We have a Wave 2 product that will affect culture. And I think that there's I think that there's an imperative for our industry that will become increasingly important. So, in a sort of pre-knowledge, that's not the term. So now if you don't know something, you can Google it. Knowledge is not as exclusive as it used to be, right? 1980, if you don't know something, it's a high hill to climb to have that knowledge. Now knowledge is much more portable and immediately accessible through some kind of search engine or tool. What is becoming more of a rate limiter for teams is cooperation, right? And so if I can have a team that doesn't necessarily have all the knowledge attributes, but does have all the cooperative attributes, that team is probably going to outperform the team that has all of the knowledge attributes, but isn't able to cooperate. And so one of the things that we're working on to challenge the resume status as the source of information about the person for selection is to create a resume or career profile that includes other attributes that predict cooperation and culture match, right? And so other companies are doing that, and we just agree with those companies, right? That this is going to be a part of the selection profile. What we want to do is we want to make the integration of those attributes into the career profile simple, elegant, and easy to consume in the same way that the resume is, instead of it being a whole bunch of different assessments that are stored on different pages and through different vendors.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I just often wondered that, because it's obviously, I mean, that's the whole thing with even that passive candidate to active candidate. It's just because someone has a job, they might have the technical skills, but I mean, it might not be a culture fit. So there's plenty of passive candidates or people who are working who aren't looking, and you could maybe convince, but at the end of the day, if they're not a culture fit, or if they're not even in line with the vision of the company, and you can't just search that. Like, there's no way for me to search on LinkedIn, and I can maybe search certain keywords, but what am I going to search? Like passionate person? Like, everyone's passionate nowadays. Everyone's awesome. Like it's hard to see that. But if you could look at, hey, I'm open to opportunities with startups, or I'm open to opportunities with companies that are in this growth phase, right? I'm looking for a company that's massively stable. If you can start to whittle that down, I think that's helpful. And then it helps with that, going back to Daniel's question of, why recruiters get a hold of them and then they drop the ball. It's stressful. It's just so much data available. And so I love that. Well, I know we've been on air for about an hour, so I don't want to take up much more of your time, but it's been an awesome conversation. And where do you have like a podcast, or you have anything that people can like check out regularly where you're talking some of these insights out? Because I think this is fascinating for a lot of people.
So I'll shoot you a link to a podcast I did on the surveillance economy. It's a passion of mine, and so maybe some of your audience would love to listen to it. It's a conversation about what is the surveillance economy, and how do we navigate it on purpose. I just put a post out today. If you were at a friend's wedding and you heard the best man give a sweet, sentimental, and moving speech about the relationship of the newlyweds, and then found out that they bought that speech online for $79, would you care? That's the intersection that we're coming up to now with the surveillance economy and the effective markets on previously human things. So I'll shoot that over to you. You can shoot it to your audience. You may find it interesting. But other than that, you can find me on my LinkedIn page. I sound off there all the time.
Well, I know you're an advisor too for recruitingdaily.com. So are you putting like a lot of content out in there as well?
I do podcasts with Recruiting Daily. I also do advisory work with Recruiting Daily, and we do some case studies that you'll be able to hear me on. If you want to do a Google search, here's a pretty lighthearted podcast I did for them. It's what Motown knew about hiring manager management. Very lighthearted podcast, but you might get a chuckle out of it. It was at the early days of COVID with a much more sizable beard than I have now.
Well, That's awesome. Well, I appreciate your time, and I really think what you guys are doing is awesome. It's going to be cool to see where you take things. For people to reach out to you, obviously LinkedIn is probably the best place to connect with Steve. You can just mention that you caught him on the show, and that'd be great. And Steve, I just want to end with, and I've been doing this recently, but let's say you're a recruiter that's 6 months in, and we're pretty much in probably the hardest time that someone could start in our industry. What advice would you give them? What advice would you give someone who's in that scenario and they're just thinking like, is this even the right industry for me? Like, what would you say to someone who's in that position?
So one of the things I think you got to ask yourself is, the highs that you experienced before this tough spot, are the highs worth the lows? The highs are high and the lows are lows in recruiting. And if the highs don't galvanize you, if they don't make you feel like you need this, the lows are probably going to be too tough. But if you have those memories of those candidates you placed, those hiring managers that you solved the unsolvable puzzle for, and that sticks with you and you brag about that to your friends and family, that's a sign that this might be good for you. And just know that what you're experiencing isn't you, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't be here. This is a tough industry, but it's worth it. And we're coming into a time in recruiting where technology and human capital are fusing together in some of the most exciting ways I've ever seen. I mean, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I have never been more excited about the problems we're solving and the prospect of actually solving those problems. And it isn't to remove people. The problem with the imperfect market of talent isn't people. It's data and predictions that don't lead us to efficient allocation of our time.
Man, I love it. So for everyone who didn't catch that, it means your job is safe because you're actually what makes recruiting awesome, which is super exciting. And honestly, it's cool because you can hear there's people who are preaching the opposite or very different to that. So Steve, I appreciate it, man. I'm going to have you just stay on the back. Everyone else, appreciate you. And I know we had a couple people say hi. So it looks like Rita said she's really interested in this field. Shows up as LinkedIn user. I don't know why. And then Debanka, he also said, hello, sir. Hello, sir, to you too. So anyone else who's viewing this afterward, definitely advise following Steve and just connecting with him as well. And we will see you guys on Friday. On Friday, we'll have the show at noon Central Time again. And all these videos are posted on YouTube, and I'll post a link to that as well in the chat. So appreciate you guys, and appreciate you, Steve. Thanks for your time, and I'm sure we'll talk again in the near future.
My pleasure. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Joel.
All right, I'm going to end this broadcast.